If you're watching as well. Everybody, thanks for joining us. We wanted to engage with you just a little bit more, and so we've spun the weekday. They're saying they can't hear us. Is that true? You can't hear us right now? They can now hear us. Cool. We're going to restart everything over. Dee Dee, hello. Shannon, hello. We're live now. So like I said, you didn't hear the amazing intro that I just did there. You just saw me shaking my hands around like a madman, a wild man. And if you're listening to this in podcast form, we're not going to edit it out. Like I want to keep it. I might shorten the silence just a little bit.
I think you probably should.
Yeah. Okay. So if you're listening to this in podcast form, you didn't hear the hilarity that just happened. We had about 30 seconds to a minute of no audio happening. I think I'm getting text messages from people. Yep, there's a text message right there saying, "Hey, we can't hear you." Great. Now we can. Thanks, Shannon.
Oh,
Shannon,
cool, yeah.
Dee Dee, hello.
Thank
Good
you
to hear from you.
Hey,
David
you know
Alonso.
what? It's good to have like instant feedback on things.
This is why we do what we do here, is so we can actually
Just
have
for the instant feedback.
The chats open
Yeah.
and everything open. Hey,
Right.
If you're joining us on Facebook, joining us on YouTube, thanks. This is episode 14 of the weekday. We wanted to engage with you. Oh, darn, Shannon says. Yeah, you missed all the hilarity there. We wanted to engage with you because this week, there's a very important thing. Well, a week from today, actually, there's a very important thing happening. We're going to get to that in a minute. But tonight, actually, there's also a very important thing happening. Do you know what it is? Very important in the life of Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay.
I mean, my son has baseball practice.
You're getting warmer.
I'm going to go ahead and say the Rays.
The Rays are playing
Okay,
tonight,
there
yeah.
we
So, hey, bro, you read. Thanks, David Alonso. I do read, yes. I can read and
Or
talk.
is it red?
Do you read?
Do you read?
Hey, bro, you read?
Yeah. This
Is
is great content.
Yeah,
let's keep going.
as we sit there and muse over what he actually meant. It's great. But anyway, the Rays are playing tonight. Go Rays. # Rays Up. Throw it in the chat, please, right now. # Rays Up. Let us know that you're on the side of the Tampa Bay Rays, because we totally are.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing that is going on in the next week is obviously we have a very large presidential election.
Sure.
And we know...
For the U.S., yeah.
For the United States, general election, yeah. And so if you're watching this abroad, sorry, you pretty much know that there's an election going on, though, because it's taking over the world. It's funny, I listen to a lot of soccer podcasts from London or England, and the opening of all these podcasts for the last month has been them talking about the U.S. election.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's primetime news for everybody.
Do you feel like people are tired of it yet?
100%. I mean... Yes. It's that weird thing that, like, people can't get enough of it. But, like, I remember seeing Stephen Colbert's, like, opening thing on, like, the Stephen Colbert, his, like, CBS Late Show or whatever. And he's obviously...
Are you up that late, or do you watch it on YouTube?
I don't know. Yes. I'm normally up that late, but I normally don't watch, like, any live TV. So,
okay.
You know, this was something... I mean, but granted, this was summer of 2016, so this was a long time ago.
Oh, okay.
Or maybe even summer of 2015. I don't know.
You only had one kid at the time.
Right. Yeah. Only one kid. Yeah. Yeah. So my sleep habits were a little more.
better.
Yeah. But I remember him having this metaphor. Obviously, you know, they're very liberal. You know, a lot of these talk show hosts and whatever. But he did this whole metaphor about how, like, you know, like President Trump running for office, obviously this was for his first term, he just like ate a whole bunch of like Oreo cookies, and like it was just like talking about it was like, oh my gosh, I can't get enough of this.
Oh, that's
But
really
it just
good.
makes you feel terrible,
That's
like
that's really good.
And so like by the end of the segment, he ate like an entire package of Oreo cookies.
I really appreciate that.
And I was like, I feel like that's how everybody feels about it.
How many calories in an Oreo cookie?
Okay.
53 calories.
53 calories per Oreo.
Per Oreo. And how many Oreos in
Again,
a
this is the
package?
content everyone comes to the weekday for.
There is 45 cookies times 53 is, 1 second, 45 times
Oh my gosh.
53. That is 2,300, almost 2,400
That's really
calories.
not as bad as I thought it was going to be.
But 2,400 calories is over the daily allotment.
Oh, no.
of-
Sure. I mean, if you're going to eat an entire package of cookies.
Oh, I mean, you got to commit.
Yeah, there's a bad reason why you're doing it.
Yeah.
But like,
I mean, he was making fun of the election.
well,
at
in
that
the
point.
grand scheme of things, that's not as much as I thought it was going to
You
be.
sacrificed your health just a
Yeah,
little
oh,
bit.
yeah.
You took half a day off.
Yeah, you
your
dive
life.
into a thing of Oreos like that. I mean, your health is the last thing on your mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
You're doing it for the comedy, doing it for the walls. But we wanted to talk about the election, and we haven't really brought it up on stream, on podcast before, because I was being serious with that question earlier. Like, do you think people are tired of it? I'm tired of it.
Oh, sure. I
And-
mean, I am too.
And yet Mike and I were having an honest conversation about it a little bit earlier in the audio studio, actually, just kind of talking about some of the things. And Mike actually had a very kind of, I don't want to say revealing quote, but
Man, we're just real into like really trying to get people, not hook people. It's revealing.
I've been watching
So
a lot of like
revealing.
stuff on SEO and
Yeah.
clickbait and all that, and just trying to get people into our content.
No, so I think because you and I, we've been talking about this a little bit. I went and voted last.
Off
yeah,
air.
I went and voted last Friday.
Steve Mage, I'm headed to get Oreos now. I'm Andy Mage, and I endorse this. Steve Mage, who does not like chocolate.
Yeah, exactly.
We will get the white chocolate one. So continue.
And then you voted. When did you vote?
I voted by mail, and I turned it in Monday.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So you and I have both voted technically.
Yep.
And
So I shut off all
Yeah.
all of the stuff. I'm done with it.
So and you know I want to start all this, and you and I were talking about this. I want to start all this by saying that like obviously I have my own political views, you have your own, and I don't necessarily want to talk about specific political views.
No.
And especially like and Pastor Matthew actually talked with the whole staff, and he does it every election cycle about how like the more we almost comment on political things, it almost like goes to disintegrate our influence and impact we have as the church. And so, like, I want to keep that in mind as well. Like, I'm not here to endorse or not endorse or whatever, and I want this to be like an honest conversation, an honest discussion with, about maybe like how we as Christians are supposed to handle this. And so there's a guy named Mark Sayers. And so for those of you that don't know Mark Sayers, I didn't know him either until a couple months ago. But he has this podcast called The Rebuilders, and he has a church out in Australia. And what he's a pastor, but he's actually like a sociologist, and he studies the cultural trends, and is incredibly intelligent. Just really, really sharp guy, understands how and why things happen within culture, and even though he's in Australia, he has a lot of connections to America, and obviously like America has sort of been like the pinnacle of Western civilization, at least for like the last 60 years, really since World War II. And so he's just kind of commenting on how things are going and shifting. And he said something and this was like probably a month ago that I heard this now, and it actually might have been a little bit further, but then he talked about it again on his Rebuilders podcast, and he said something to the effect of, nowadays, we as our society, even like America, for example, isn't so much as a lot of people are saying it's post-Christian, but really like we're almost moving past like post-Christianity into like this. We as a culture, basically, we want the kingdom, without the king. And and it seems to be like amplified going into like the election season, as it always does. Like a lot of people place their hopes in, and Pastor Matthew even talked about this, people place their hopes in either a donkey or an elephant.
Right.
And really, like, our hope needs to be placed in the lamb.
The lamb, yeah.
And so, like, I just think it's super interesting that we as, and like I was talking to you about this earlier, and this is kind of how it started, but, I watch, certain things on YouTube or, certain things on TV that comment a lot on sort of, just cultural things. And a lot of them have to do with political stuff. And again, for me personally, I try to get like a healthy dose of both sides. I try to get some conservative things. I try to get some liberal things. I want to understand what's happening before I make a decision or before I formulate an opinion.
Before you go any further with
Yeah.
that, so I've heard that, and I'm like that. I want to get both sides, but I heard an interesting take on kind of sitting in your own camp. Like the left is always going to be the left, the right's always going to be the right, et cetera, et cetera. And it's because there is such a fatigue with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is so fast that we don't actually have time to learn or absorb the other side, because we're still trying to catch up with our own tribe. Agree, disagree?
I mean, I definitely think that that's part of it. Like, especially, looking at how social media acts, looking at how it operates, I guess, how, and we've talked about before the movie, The Social Dilemma, and a lot of these things that we interact with, social media networks, like, their only goal is to keep you like plugged in. They don't want to, your news feed that's really a misnomer. Like there's not news on there. It's really what you just want to see,
right,
so that you can continue to like be locked in. And it creates these echo chambers. It creates only what you want to hear. So partially, like, yes, I think that we don't have time. But I also think that both sides do a lot to spread not just disinformation, but just like an avalanche, an overwhelming amount of information that like we physically and mentally can't keep up with. And so, yeah, I mean, I think part of that is true, but I think it's a lot more nuanced and complex than just like, we don't have time, because like, I think that we have time for other people. We have time for other people's, I think we have time for other people's opinions and thoughts and conversations but again, so anyway, back to what I was saying, like, I watch these things on YouTube, these political commentators, both on the right and the left, and like, there's almost like this revivalistic, and this is something that Mark Sayers said too, there's this like revivalistic energy, this just like fervor for the kingdom without the king. And so this one thing I was watching, they were talking about, immigrants and how, it was more of a left-leaning thing, and talking about immigration all the time. I was like, well, I kind of agree with that. Like, yeah. And, or, watching something like this, I was like, oh, well, I kind of agree with that. But like, there's zero mention of the church. There's zero mention of God. And they're trying to legislate the kingdom into being, when like the church actually needs to be the one that stands in that gap, and really help bring that thing forward.
So Rebecca in the chat, she just asked a really good question. She said, will it always be a pick of the lesser of two evils?
Yeah. I mean,
like, you and I are not sociology majors. We're not political sociologists.
right.
But literally, we were in Publix yesterday having this exact
Sure.
same discussion of, it seems like you're going to have to pick the lesser of two evils. And I don't, for me, even as a believer saying that, it feels like I have to just kind of throw my hands up and like, I don't know, like I got to make a chart of like
Sure.
pros and cons and
Yeah.
all that. And like, I don't want to have to do that.
I mean, I think the problem is when we, so much of life, so much of our problems happen when, and Pastor Matthew talks about this a lot too, so much of, we run into problems when we like put everything in life into binaries. It's either good or it's bad. It's either love or it's hate, or, it's, but in reality, like, so much of life is actually on like a spectrum,
right.
And like there's always something in the middle. There's always that like murky middle or whatever. And we just, a lot of the times it's easy for us to just polarize things and just say it's this or this, because I don't, it's not even that I don't have time. It's that I don't have energy. I don't want to put myself through basically the pain of having to just dive deep into like the muck of something to really work on figuring out maybe what the actual truth is or what the actual meaning behind something is. I don't know. But like, will it always be the pick of lesser of two evils? Like, I think that I was listening to a podcast with N.T. Wright, and if you don't know who N.T. Wright is, he's this,
Best guy.
he's a theologian. He's an author. He's a doctor. I mean, like, just incredibly intelligent person, but very kind, very slow, very gentle. And someone asked him the question of, like, is it our Christian duty to vote? And
Ooh.
yeah. And so he was just saying, like, there's no biblical mandate, obviously, for us to vote. But, like, if like an early Christian or, somebody in Judea was given the option in the Roman government, because that's how he views everything. He's a New Testament scholar. If they were given the option to vote, like and Paul was maybe at like, presiding over a group of people or whatever, like he would probably tell them like, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like go vote. And I think it's our job, to really try and sift through, from a biblical mindset, maybe what the things to vote for are and all that kind of stuff.
So I guess, and that's the voting part of this, but I want to take it back to the kingdom without the king thing.
Right.
And I got a tab pulled up here. I typed into the internet, basically God's kingdom, or God, what did I type in? God's government or something.
Yeah.
Because if you've ever read the Old Testament or you have any knowledge of the Old Testament, basically God instituted a governmental structure for Israel with him as the top, him being the king.
Right.
And then the kingdom organized around it such that it was, there was a division of labor with the priests and the Levites, and then there was people serving under them, and then ultimately people would gather 3 times a year, really, but it ended up being a lot more each year to pay homage to God, to, have their sins wiped away and all this other stuff. And then Israel ended up asking for a king. And the thing I found interesting is that it's clear from Genesis 17 and Deuteronomy 17 that God anticipated Israel having a king or a judge. Like, I've always been under the assumption that God was angry that the Israelites said, we want a king, we want a king, we want a king. But it wasn't that. It's that you can look back at the prophecy and see, like, yeah, okay, you're going to have a king.
Right.
That the title is of little importance. Having a king was not the real issue because God had already planned for Israel to have a king. Every organization must have a leader, so God lays down instructions as to how the leader should conduct himself in office. They're designed to ensure that the king does not elevate himself above the people and rule as a despot. Instead, he is to be thoroughly familiar with and guided by the attitudes and laws of God.
Yeah.
He must comprehensively know that his own nature is just like those he serves, and to be humbled.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Like, we see that at the very beginning of Saul's reign. Saul, God says, like, that's the guy right there. Like, yes, he's tall, he's stately, he looks like a king. Obviously, Saul went crazy, tried to kill a bunch of people. Like, he wasn't following the Lord, and he was of himself. But then you look at King David, the first true, real, good king of Israel. And what does the Bible always say about David?
He's a man after God's own heart.
He's a man after God's own heart. And then the key to the understanding of the significance of Israel's demand in 1 Samuel 8, which is, hey, we want a king, is that she desires a king just like the other nations, which I'd never put that together. I'd always heard that part and just said, like, yeah, okay, they wanted a king.
Yeah.
Just like, and I'd always just assumed, like, okay, they always want the king that's going to be like the other nations.
Right.
The nations, the Assyrians and everybody around them, the Phoenicians and the Philistines, they had kings, and Israel looked at that king and went, well, I want somebody like that. I don't want somebody that's going to be humble and all this other stuff. And for me, I kind of take that back to the N.T. Wright question of, like, if these people don't uphold the biblical mandates of leadership,
right,
like, should I be voting for them? And I don't know how to square that question necessarily, other than our duty as Christians, and you brought this up in the studio too, or maybe it's at Publix or something, but our duty as Christians is to take care of the fatherless, to take care of the widows, to take care of the orphans, and to really allow people to live and breathe in God's kingdom.
Right.
So I don't know where.
Well, and I think that, like, it's unfortunate that I don't need to vote for anybody to make that happen.
Right. And we have that freedom in the U.S. by the way.
And I don't need the government to do that. I don't need to wait on an elected official to take care of my neighbor.
Right.
And just like, we have this conversation a lot here on staff, and I have this conversation a lot with people on the worship team and the worship ministry. But when we talk about pastors and like, Peter, right, calls us to be a part of the royal priesthood. Like we are all a part of the royal priesthood. Like we all literally carry around God's presence with us. And we're all called in some way, shape, or form to have a pastor's heart.
Right.
And, like I don't need a title for that. I don't need someone to give me permission to do that. Like God has already given me everything possible to fulfill the things that he has called us to do, and then with under that umbrella, like, sure, like voting, comes into that.
Sure.
But I don't need to wait on somebody to do something that like God has already called me to do.
Sure.
And
you and I come from, I'm 37, and I was kind of right on the tail edge, well, maybe the middle edge, and you were kind of right smack dab in the middle of the emergent church,
Sure.
quote unquote, which was based around the social gospel of
Right.
all I need to do is get out there and love and everything will be taken care of. And there is huge merit to that. I mean, if
Yeah.
you watched Kicking It with Matthew yesterday with Pastor Matthew, who warmed this seat, I asked him what his favorite of the fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5:22-23 was, and he kind of joked and he just said, like, of course, it's the very first one, love. Like,
Yeah.
love is the very first, and I knew where he was going with that. But so we were right in the middle of that coming up in our Christendom.
Right.
But I think there's a culture around us that looks at especially of churches, that looks at the emergent church and says, well, that thing died out years ago.
Sure.
We need to be less about love and we need to be more about spontaneity in our worship, or we need to be more about this, that, or the other. And I don't know how that's going to bleed into politics, but I'm hoping that like those views start to be instilled back just a little bit more.
Interesting.
The love and the emergent church thing, because I almost feel like, and we don't need to get into this now because we definitely don't have enough time, but
Right.
it's the millennial thing. Because if you think about millennials,
Yeah.
they were tied to the emergent church. Like, look, one of the biggest emergent church guys out there, like Rob Bell or Donald Miller, like they're not doing a whole lot for the church anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But they wrote these amazing bombastic pieces that people just grabbed onto.
Yeah.
And yes, they're still, doing ministry and all that other stuff, but and again, I don't want to turn this into a thing, but I almost look at that as the rest of the world looks at the millennial generation and says, yeah, okay, you're coming up in the business world, but take a seat there, Sonny, because you don't know what you're doing. And it feels like that's almost being forced out of politics as well, is like are we actually going to care for people? Are we
Right.
going to look at people? Are we going to connect with people? Like, what's the deal there?
Well, and I think that, it's, so like for me, it's super difficult because, and I've seen a bunch of people talk about this and tweet about it. It's hard to find as a millennial or whatever, and who's in the church and all that kind of stuff. I don't really, I'm involved with politics in the sense that like it's a civic duty, kind of like we were talking about a little bit. But you and I were talking a little bit beforehand about like if you are truly a Christian, and even now like a millennial, a Christian, trying to follow after God's call in your life, whatever it looks like, and most of the time it's love people and love God, and kind of all the rest hang off of that. But like you will find yourself to be pretty politically homeless. And I've seen a lot of people talk about this where like you don't really, and again, like I think part of the problem is, to answer a little bit of that question, but like part of the problem is like things tend to get sifted to the fringes,
Right.
to the edges.
Right. And like you said, it's easier to polarize things
It
than it is to live in the tension.
It's so much, but like that's not.
What's the Andy Stanley thing? Like it's not most of what we live is not a problem to be solved.
Yeah,
it's
the tension to be managed.
Yeah.
And like I think that if we're going to do that, then both sides have great things to say. And like it makes being a Christian, and especially now, unfortunately, like there's a lot of negative connotations when it comes to being a Christian and talking about politics. And rightfully so.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of people that have done a lot of damage to that idea. And like a lot of it makes people worried. It's just like, for a lot of people who don't believe, I remember hearing this in high school even, talking about George W. Bush and how like he prays and, he wants to hear from God and what he wants to do. And a lot of people who aren't believers like think that that's crazy.
Yeah, they deride it.
Yeah, like, oh my gosh, what are you gonna wait for an imaginary God to tell you what to do? Like, what does that mean for my tax dollars then? And like I understand that, but like I wish there was room for that. I don't know. But regardless, like let's say that like that's kind of actually what I believe. Like I do think that we need to take time and search our soul and like really like meditate on these things. And I don't think either side really believe that.
Yeah, no, I
I
agree
like
with
that's
you.
just even in that tiny little thing, like that puts me squarely like in the tension of these two things, and it's like I don't know, like I feel out of place in a lot of different things, but I do think that that's kind of where we're supposed to be.
Absolutely.
And what we were talking about in the studio is the church is supposed to be the thing in the middle that is, that leads the way in defending the homeless, defending the widows, the orphans, like really trying to be smart and creative and loving and humble
And to trust that the Lord is going to make up for all of the downfalls of either political side and to allow us as the church to, there's proud Republicans and proud Democrats that go here and they coexist peaceably.
Right.
Peacefully. Goodness. Like, go figure.
Yeah.
It can happen.
Right.
It can actually happen.
And I think a lot of I was listening to a podcast today. It's called Your Undivided Attention, and they were talking about social media and how around 2011, 2012, like they really to gain your attention more and more on social medias, they try to on social media networks, they instilled what they call the outrage machine, and now like TVs and newspapers and blogs and all that kind of have sort of followed suit again, because like wow, that's a really great way to get people engaged. And unfortunately, like we're stuck in sort of the middle of this outrage machine, and it makes conversations very difficult.
Yeah, and it's almost like we're all adrenaline junkies in that we go from zero to angry in a split second.
Well, and like there's was it cortisol?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's the stress hormone, and like it fuels us because like how we are wired as humans, like if we're getting chased, if we're getting chased by someone who wants to do harm to us, like adrenaline, cortisol, like into your system because like you need to survive, and like it's an incredible thing that God has wired us with, but like our brain doesn't know the difference between that and a differing opinion on Facebook,
Absolutely. Well, we're going to start to wrap up here. This is a good discussion. I think we need to continue it a little bit further after next Tuesday.
Oh my gosh, next Tuesday is going to be nuts.
Next Tuesday is going to be crazy, but here's the thing. I don't think it ends next Tuesday.
Well, and that's a really good, like I saw another pastor that I follow on Twitter just said like, if you think that next Tuesday doesn't matter who wins, if you think next Tuesday is the end of this, like you were lying to yourself. Like we have been swallowing poison for even before I was born, like this is stuff that is not new to anybody. And to our culture, to our society, and like it went on long before I was around, and it'll continue on long after I'm gone.
Absolutely.
So,
I want to close out with this comment we got from Dee Dee. So Dee Dee, Rebecca, Shannon, everybody else in the chat, Steve Mage, everybody else that's been in the chat kind of commenting. Thanks for watching along live. Dee Dee, we're closing up with your comment. And she said, and I think we really all have a lot more in common regardless of what side of the aisle we're on.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Totally.
Yes and amen. And I want to close with that awesome thought. Thank you so much for joining us here live, if you're live, and if not, throw us a comment below if you're watching this on YouTube or anywhere else on Bay Hope TV on demand, or if you're listening on Apple Music or Apple Podcast, or on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. We will see you next time.
See you later.